but he's going in the 7th round, and he's set up to like very straightforwardly have 130 plus targets, but basically pretty comfortably return like 3rd to 4th round value based on his profile, based on the rest of this offense, etc. In the 7th round, though, it's like, man, it's not just a small hit. He's going to be a comfortably big hit.
The best pick in every round for 2025. That is what we're going to talk about a little bit today on the RotoViz Fantasy Football Podcast. My name is Colm Kelly. I am joined once again by Ben Gretch, the creator of Stealing Signals. Ben, I didn't dive into it at the end of the last show, but I want to give you a minute off the top here to give some hype. I'm sure everyone listening already knows about the content over there, Stealing Signals, but give your elevator pitch as to why people should check it out.
Sure. Yeah. It's a newsletter. I consistently hear that this is the best format for my work, or became the best format of my work when I started doing it this way in 2020, based on or relative to my earlier years when I was writing for different sites and trying to, I think, find a voice that was more professional in those things. But now I just kind of write about what I want to write about, however I want to write about it. And that sort of stream of consciousness style, I think, fits. If you've listened to the podcast, you're very aware. It kind of fits the way that I think. And people seem to really enjoy that. And so the other thing that I consistently hear is that I provide a needed different perspective than a lot of other content out there. And so I try to write about concepts that I think are under discussed or undercovered. I don't necessarily I don't spend all my time doing all the things that all the sites always make sure to do, because it's just a newsletter, but I try to fill holes that other sites do. So I consistently say you should have a subscription somewhere else like RotoViz, that you can get, a lot of the really important key stuff that you'll need for your fantasy football drafts and your leagues and the tools and all of that kind of stuff. What I'm trying to provide is a different type of look. And as far as recent posts, last Friday wrote a piece called "One of the Most Common Forms of Analysis is Actively Harmful to Good Fantasy Football Play," and talked about something that I see a lot in the space that I think actually lands people on the wrong type of players and keeps them away from the right type of players. That's a concept you'll be familiar with if you've listened to the pods and all those things, but I do think it was a good piece. And I actually had a comment that said this may be the best thing you've ever written. And then just today, as we're recording this, I wrote a post earlier this morning that was everything you need to know to get up to speed for 2025. It had a ton of links to a bunch of the old evergreen stuff that I've written, as well as a bunch of stuff I've written through the offseason in 2025. So if you're a new subscriber, you want to get caught up, there is a ton of links in that post where you can find a lot of good, useful, old reading from the past.
Awesome. That is bengretch.substack.com. I'll leave a link as well in the show notes for anyone that wants to head on over and check it out. We also did record earlier this week where we kind of, we talked about the stream of consciousness, Ben, and your writing, but we kind of had a stream of consciousness where we talked through some things that people may be thinking, I don't want to say thinking wrong of it, but maybe if you listen to it, it might change some of the ways you're thinking about the 2025 season. And I think when you're reading Ben's work, you'll find a lot of that. You can also check out him and Sean have some fantastic conversations. Sometimes the conversations happen for 4 hours before they do record their podcast, and then they record for another 4 hours, but always fantastic conversations. We are going to kick it off here and have a little bit of, I think, an interesting time where we look through the kind of landscape from an ADP perspective. I will be pulling up the FFPC ADP for this one and sharing it on screen for people watching along. We'll get Ben's thoughts, and I'm going to do it in like cohorts of rounds, because I do think that there's pockets of the draft that tie together. You've obviously round 1, round 2, round 3, but I think like 4 and 5, 6 through 8, 9 through 11, that kind of range. We'll kind of get into some of that. But Ben, we are going to kick it off here at the top of the board with round 1. I think that this season we are set up with, I think, maybe a historic round 1 in terms of I think round 1 probably is going through 15 or 16 players for this season. Whereas sometimes if you're picking at round, spot 10, you feel like, well, I've missed out on that, tier 1 of player. I think like when you're looking at Malik Neighbors going 9th overall or Puka Nacua going 12th and tight end premium formats over at the FFPC, I think there's lots of value to be had there. And maybe even the best picks this year in these drafts will prove to be that kind of 9 or 10 range. But round 1, I think they're all pretty much good picks. But is there anyone that stands out where you're like, that's the guy? If I can pick the draft spot and he's there at ADP, that's the way I want to start off my draft.
Yeah, one of the things I love about this show compared to the last one we did, towards the end of the last one, I was talking about this idea of you got to place your bets. And all the analysis we do, we could be wrong. And we were talking about all those kinds of concepts in the last show, but ultimately we're trying to figure out whether we like making the bet at a certain cost adjusted place. I like making the bets on pretty much all these first round players, right? So this will be a fun show where we're going to talk through the bets that we like to make it a lot of different costs. In the first round, throughout the rest of the offseason, I'm going to probably bounce around a lot. There's going to be periods of time where I like different guys more. I really like both Neighbors and Nakua, who you mentioned. I wrote down Jahmyr Gibbs for this one. Jahmyr Gibbs right now, as I sit here on June 23rd, as we're recording this, is the dude that I said on the last episode of Stealing Bananas that we recorded last week, for anyone who listened to it, I think should be the 102, should be the RB1 probably. And Siegel had mentioned that in one of his drafts that he had done on his own recently that he took Gibbs 102. And so we had a little moment talking about that we kind of both independently were that high on him essentially. And so I think getting him at 105 overall as the RB3, consistently going behind Bijan, who he came out with, and he's been more explosive than and more dynamic than, and shown more real ceiling, particularly if you look at those games where David Montgomery's missed. And you think about the fact that Gibbs is going into year 3 and Montgomery's getting this much closer to age 30. And those types, not just that Montgomery might miss time, but the split might lean more towards Gibbs as we go over the years, right? You would expect it to, I think. A new offensive coordinator might lean it that way more. I don't think there's any way a new offensive coordinator could come in and use Gibbs less. But I do think it's possible they could come in and go, I need to use this guy even more than we're using him. Because look at what he's done in the games that Montgomery missed. Look what he did in week 18 when we had the division on the line and he had 4 touchdowns to beat the Vikings. Look what he did in our playoff loss when nothing else was going right, but Jahmyr Gibbs had a monster game, right? These 2 games that didn't impact the fantasy season, week 18 in the playoffs, were Gibbs, I believe, his 2 highest scoring PPR games of the year. And so I don't think those are in people's mind either. If those would have hit in week 3 and week 5 early in the year, people would be talking about Jahmyr Gibbs as the RB1, no question. He's a young player. He's been so dynamic. He's incredibly good in the pass game. He's in an elite offense that will run the ball in the red zone a ton. He's got a ton of touchdown equity. The floor to me is so high, even with the split with Montgomery, and the ceiling is I broke fantasy football this year if he just really dominates the backfield like he has in the games that Montgomery's missed, where he's been a 27, 28 point per game type score. That's like prime Christian McCaffrey stuff, the way that Gibbs has scored without Montgomery in over the, whatever it is, 6 or 7 games that he's played without Montgomery over the last 2 years. And yeah, it's a small sample, but he scored really, really well when Montgomery's been on the field as well. I mean, this guy's incredibly talented.
Yeah, and I've just pulled it up here on the screen from the NFL Stat Explorer. But if you look at across the board, like he's as evenly distributed in terms of like yards per carry, opportunities, attempts. He's in the top 12 for everything across the league. People may say like touchdown regression, he was number 1 overall last season, and that statistic. But you mentioned the end of the season. Like if we look at the way things finished out here, there's a lot of green on it in that 46-point game against Minnesota. I think that there's just so much more. Like it's hard to say there's meat left on the bone for a player who has like shown such upside in those certain situations. But I think people are pricing in the fact that it's going to be a case again where David Montgomery is a kind of major thorn in the side. And I do feel like it's going to be hard for the team unless they want to have a situation where they're saving him for the playoffs. That sort of scenario where they don't want to overwork him during the regular season. But I think if they just continue, particularly, use him in the passing game and to be able to show how explosive he can be that way, it's extremely exciting to see what he can do this year.
And that was a really exciting thing about that playoff loss. You got the visual up. I just looked at it. I think he scored about 35 points in the playoff loss. 11 targets, 6 catches, 70 yards in a game where he also ran for 105 and 2 touchdowns on the ground. So he had this, the 670 receiving line was his best receiving line of the year in terms of, receptions and yards. And the 11 targets was a season high. If you look at the end of his season, he had 4+ targets in the last 6 regular season games as well.
And that's what you want. If you get a floor of those like target numbers, the other thing, like, we go on about David Montgomery as if, like I mentioned the word thorn in the side, and it was a case that you were like, they're using him in situations where it's like taking away from what Gibbs could potentially give. Like he is not as good as Jahmyr Gibbs, and he was still getting into the end zone here. Like he's getting those touchdowns. But look through the numbers, like 65% of the time last season was a running back 1, 29% a running back 2, So, 94% of the time is at least a top 24 running back. And pretty much every game, even when he was a RB3, is 10 plus points per game. So
and it's so hard for people to understand that when you do know that he's not getting all of the work. And then people will say, well, what about with Ben Johnson not being there? And it's like, yeah, but how much different? The personnel is similar, man. Defenses still have to respect Amon-Ra. They still have to respect Jameson Williams. They still have to respect Laporta. It still creates a lot of opportunity for these running backs. How much different do you think this offense is going to be? Like, yeah, if Jared Goff gets hurt or all these different things that can happen to, anyone, that can be pretty damning. Like that can be problematic, but I don't see a scenario where that all this stuff that you're talking about where Gibbs is a lot worse than that. That's why I say small hit, big win. He might be just a later first round value if things really don't go his way. And then if they go his way, he's the most important player in fantasy. I mean, that's the way his profile looks to me. It's so dramatic and exciting. That's true of most of the first round players, but for Gibbs, it's I think more dramatic.
Yeah, and if you look at, you mentioned if the season didn't hit as much, like I think he's probably going where Gentry's going at the 10th spot next year, whereas like even Barkley had an amazing season last year. If Christian McCaffrey has a down season this year, like because of the trajectory of their career, they're just kind of sliding in a much different direction moving into next season. Moving into the second round, we have like just a landslide of good names here again, as I mentioned. I think there's one player in this that I keep calling the most under, like the mispriced player of 2025 over at the FFPC. But give me who your player to draft in this round is.
I want to know yours. Who's yours?
Well, I like a lot of these names. I just think George Kittle is like just so egregiously priced and tight end premium in particular. He's going as the last pick of this round, tight end 3, but I also think that he fits into that range here where you do have that little bit of a tier break, particularly with the wide receiver group. You then have Bucky Irving, but I think that there's a slight gap. And I know we talked in the last show about certainty, but the upside cases for some of the other names that come after that. But yeah, I love George Kittle.
I like that. I completely agree with your point about the and Siegel said it a lot as well about the first round going into the second round, going basically 16 names deep. So one of the names, I'm going to look at this two ways. First, as far as the best pick in the second round, I think the easy answer is the first 4 names: Amon-Ra St. Brown, Devon Achane, Brian Thomas, Nico Collins. If you have the option to draft any of those guys at any point in the second round, if they slide a little bit in the second round, whatever, I think you're in incredible shape because you're getting a first round profile as your second pick. The one that I wrote down for that range was Achane because the other 3 are all wide receivers, but I really don't. I mean, Achane to me is
you're starting a robust running back draft here. Is that what you're
I guess I am. Yeah. No, but it's because we're going to get into a lot of wide receiver picks here pretty soon as we start getting into the other rounds. You get to about 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 every round. It's going to be a wide receiver pick. But those guys in the beginning, if you don't have the option of taking those guys, I think that's where it gets interesting. And that's what I love about your Kittle pick. It's like, I think you could justify taking him as high as 205 because that's where the drop off is. And it's like, okay, in ADP, the next guy is Derrick Henry. I think it's flat from there for a long way. The one name beyond that point that's really intriguing to me, in addition to Kittle, because I like your call, is Drake London, who's actually only going 2 picks beyond there at 206. But I think London has more of a chance to fall to like 208, 209 than any of Amon-Ra or Brian Thomas or Nico. And if you get the chance to start taking London in the later part of the second round, particularly on FFPC, on Underdog, he's going even higher than this. So you're not going to get that chance. But if you get the chance to take London in the later part of the second round at any point, that's where I think he becomes a really fun bet that he maybe belongs as part of that extended first round because his profile looks really good too. Kirk Cousins was bad last year, but this Zach Robinson offense came over from the Rams, really concentrated. They were really concentrated with their volume with Bijan. They did a lot of the 11 personnel that the Rams schemes have always done. They used a ton of Ray McLeod. This was a big part of the issue with Kyle Pitts. Is the promise of Kyle Pitts is you split him out, use him at wide receiver and everything. They didn't do that. They made him play as the single tight end instead of this flex like second tight end. And then because of that, he was kind of miscast because he's asked to block a lot more and he's not a great blocker. And so they found in situations that they like Charlie Warner more than him. And it's like, you're just using this guy wrong. It doesn't fit your offense. It's the opposite of something we talked about in the last scheme about the last show about fitting scheme to talent. They were trying to fit talent to scheme. They liked their scheme, and Kyle, Kyle Pitts is not. I mean, anyway, if you're playing Ray McLeod a ton and not playing Kyle Pitts because you need to get Charlie Warner on the field, you're probably too obsessed with your specific scheme. But having said that, I think there's a lot of issues with Kyle Pitts' profile as well going into this year. He struggled last year. You still only have Ray McLeod and Darnell Mooney as the other receivers. Bijan Robinson. I mean, Drake London going into this year is in a position now where he's, I think, clearly gapping the other players in his offense in terms of target earning potential. He matched a career high targets per route from 2022, which was a low route Arthur Smith offense where he had really consolidated some targets per route. This was a much higher route role that he was in last year, but still had a really high rate of targets per route. He also matched a career high in yards per target after the target efficiency from 2023. In 2024, he matched both of the career highs on both sides of that, which gave him a career high yards per route on a career high routes run. Very impressive season for him. And really importantly, when Michael Penix took over and he's actually able to throw the ball into these intermediate ranges in a way that Cousins really struggled to drive the ball into those ranges all of last season, London was a monster, including a week 18 where he had like 18 targets. I do think that the stuff that Penix does well, I don't know that Penix is going to be a smash, but Penix will push the ball. He throws aggressively into the intermediate ranges, and he's accurate in those ranges. That's what he does particularly well. It's a pocket passer. He doesn't scramble a lot. He does not take sacks. He'll get the ball out into the intermediate ranges particularly. And so it's not like huge splash plays, but it's chunk plays. And that's exactly what Drake London does well. I think he's a really good fit for what they're going to try to do in the pass game. And I think he's clearly the wide receiver one in his offense. So I think there's a real potential for even after last year, I just mentioned career highs kind of across the board in routes and in per route numbers. I think there's the potential for the quarterback play to be better throughout the season or a better fit for him and better, frankly, because Cousins was just bad last year. And I think that could mean a really big breakout season for London in this offense.
Yeah, I think he's certainly interesting. Just to highlight last week's Stealing Bananas, you and Sean did talk. You mentioned about Jahmyr Gibbs. We also talked quite a bit about Amon-Ra St. Brown, Nico Collins as well on that show. So I'd recommend, the case for those guys listening for those conversations on last week's Stealing Bananas. On George Kittle, just to share it over, I do think that like Christian McCaffrey coming back in could be something that eats into, but he is somebody who again is very flat across the board. And we look at the range of outcomes and the ways that he can impact the game, the yards after the catch ability. Last year he was just only 7th at the position. I think there's room to grow there. But if we look at like tight end 1 weeks, and they're not huge weeks in terms of the total points numbers, but very consistent, 87% of the time as a TE1 for 2024. But yeah, without Deebo Samuel there and the splits, between him and when Samuel is absent, and we're going to have Ayuk working his way back, that could be a little bit later in the season. I think there's a lot of ceiling there. Moving into round 3, Ben, I think round 3 becomes a little bit, there's parts of me that like there's certain other rounds that I almost want 2 players from rather than some of the players in round 3, but round 3 becomes a bit challenging. I find, some of my favorite guys, like the likes of a T. Higgins or Rashee Rice or Garrett Wilson or JSN, players like for years we've been like these guys a lot. But then there's a lot of question marks around them. I'll be interested to see if any of the wide receiver comes up, but they just have some question marks around them this year overall. Who are you hitting on round 3 here?
I love that you said there's some rounds you want to take multiple guys, because I looked at this. I could make a case for Rashee Rice. I could make a case for several of the other wide receivers probably. I think you can make a pretty strong case for the quarterbacks. And based on this FFPC pricing where Lamar and Josh Allen are both in the front half of the round, but Jaden Daniels is 311. I think I would say Jaden Daniels is a little more of an interesting value at a half round discount to the other two. But my answer was actually a player that's not going in round 3. It was Kenneth Walker. I wrote down Kenneth Walker. He's at 403. They brought over Clint Kubiak. They want to run the ball. It's all they've talked about this offseason. I don't think Sam Darnold's a particularly great QB. Walker, his missed tackles forced rate last year was absolutely absurd. The frustrating thing is his yards after contact not great, because he's breaking these tackles and then he's running too laterally. Yes. But that, I think, was and a big reason why they fired Ryan Grubb after 1 year. I think some of that was scheme related. Some of that was the run scheme was not designed intelligently. I think Mike Macdonald's a really sharp coach. I'm not sure I believe that about Ryan Grubb. And I think Macdonald learned that throughout the season and said, look, I want to fire this guy. Even though I hired him this offseason and thought he would be my offensive coordinator as I took over my first head coaching job and would be the guy I'd build next to. And they didn't even have a terrible offensive year last year. He was like, I need to fire him because schematically it's not working. And so they go out and they bring Clint Kubiak in specifically to run the ball. They've talked about how much they want to run the ball. McDonald's talked about specifically how they want to be able to run the ball in the red zone. I think this scheme will allow Kenneth Walker to get more downhill, will allow him some more like yards before contact opportunities, where it's a lot like what Saquon got when he went to the Eagles, where suddenly he's now getting to make his moves on the second level of defenders and show his athleticism and his dynamism down the field, as opposed to when he was with the Giants, he had to do all that in the backfield, and then he's not able to, create enough on his own.
Yeah,
they're not going to have the line
Walker's
that the Eagles
making them
have.
moves at the second level. The DBs aren't stopping it.
They're not going to have the offensive line that the Eagles had. They're not going to be as dominant, but I do think schematically that's the benefit, is it's going to create opportunities for Walker to get more explosive plays because of that, because they're going to get a little more downhill before the point of attack, and then he's going to be able to just run away with it. And that's the stuff that, okay, Walker's profile is explosive plays. Walker's profile is very dynamic. They've talked about wanting to use him in the pass game still a lot. I do think Zach Charbonnet is probably a pretty good second running back, and there's maybe some minor concern there, but you get a nice little discount on Walker and how high the ceiling could be here at 403. And he's the guy that basically in the second half of the third round that I would be prioritizing.
Yeah, he's going to RB15. It is a case that is where the QBs go, and Daniel's been the QB3, I do think, so a misprice there. I think there's a lot of room for him to grow. And I think, again, people are remembering, the midpoint of last season where he's like, has that rib injury. They're not running him as much, and he's kind of protecting himself, and how things took off after that. But I feel like that round is pretty flat. You get, like, I'm happy to draft Chase Brown, if that's the option there. But I'm like, when I'm at the back of the second round, I'm hoping that Kittle makes it to me. If Kittle goes before it gets to that point, I'm kind of like, Higgins or Rice or Wilson or JSN. I kind of almost want to like trade back to get the last one of that tier rather than have to select the first one in that group. But yeah, Kenneth Walker being pulled up, 3 running backs to kick things off here from Gretch, which wasn't on my bingo card.
Well, I also brought up Drake London. I kind of split
covered
the second round in half. Yeah.
So now we have the 4th and 5th round. So I don't know. Kenneth Walker's got pulled up into the 3rd. You've increased the ADP. So you can pick one per round if you want, but if you want to pick one from round 4 or round 5 to get onto the roster.
Yeah, I'm going to go. Well, I mean, I think Xavier Worthy's an easy one at this cost at 409. But
I thought he was the one that you were going to pull into the 3rd round. That's what I thought.
He's late in the 4th, behind Mike Evans, behind Terry McLaurin, who I do like, but I think was fortunate to catch as many touchdowns as he did last season. And I do think it's hard for him to really smash above this cost. Devontae Adams is the 401 in ADP right now. I think Worthy should be going ahead of those veterans.
It is a very veteran round. If you look, like he's the only young wide receiver when you take in Adams, McLaurin, Evans, and more.
I'm going to go a different young wide receiver at 503, and it's very similar to my London case where I think it's talent meets situation. It's Tet McMillan, the rookie. A lot of people talked in the prospect season about him not having the 9 routes. And I know Matt Harmon's reception perception does awesome work and showed that he didn't run a lot of 9 routes. And there's been a lot of talk about his quarterback not really being particularly good at throwing those. Those purely deep, like 9 routes are just straight down the field, right? But when you look at Matt Harmon's charting on him and what routes he actually did run, he also didn't run the underneath routes, the quick slants, the bubble screens, the quick drags. Those were all below average for a wide receiver as well. The routes he did run, and it was above average, and every single one was every route that breaks at 10 yards. So you're talking about the post, the corner, the dig, the out, the comeback, the curl, both, turning both ways, moving across the field, anything that's in the intermediate range. A lot of what I was just talking about with Drake London, which again, cover 2 shells, the ways that defenses are trying to take away explosive plays. Those are the ones that if you can rack up a lot of volume, is what I was just kind of saying with London, you can have a huge season by consistently getting chunk plays, not splash 40-yard plays, but 10, 15, 20-yard plays are huge. Tet McMillan has that in spades. And so people were talking about what he can't do in the prospect discussion, pre-draft, that kind of thing. There was talk that he might fall all the way out of the top 20 picks. He got the validation on draft night. He went top 10. He has a 3-year early declare profile where he had 800 plus yards as a true freshman, then went 1,400 plus both of the next 2 years. That's the type of RotoVizian profile we love immediately, full stop. That all sorts of production at age adjusted. It's great. He's got the physical tools, but he's not as dominant down the field as people want him to be for a 6'4" whatever guy. But he's really, really, really good in the intermediate. And my point is, if he wasn't making all these huge, big downfield plays, how was he still able to put up 800 yards as a true freshman and then 1,400 in both his sophomore and junior years? It's because he's that dominant at the stuff he does do well. And a lot of times when we're talking about how guys transfer to the NFL, the jump in competition, all that stuff, we want to know that they have transferable skills. The reasons that like certain players have busted over the years, they've sometimes been too reliant on gimmicky routes. Again, as I mentioned, he didn't run a lot of bubble screens, quick hits, none of that stuff. That's not his game. He's running real routes into the intermediate range and putting up 1,400 yards doing it. No one could stop it, even though that was their whole offense. Was to just throw the ball, especially last year. They were not very good. 2023, a little bit better. They still had Jacob Cowing. They did some different things. Maybe you could say he benefited from that. Last year, the defense's whole job was to stop Tet McMillan, and he still put up 1,400 yards running those routes. That's the transferable skill. That's the thing that Adam Thielen's been able to really pair well with Bryce Young the last couple of years. That's what Bryce Young throws well as well. It's about what Penix does. Bryce Young doesn't have to hit a ceiling to do that stuff. Bryce Young's ceiling is more dependent on his ability to do a lot of different things, but he will be able to throw those routes. The same thing as Penix. I don't think Penix has to be better than what he is as a prospect to throw those particular routes. That's the stuff that they do well. They have to be able to do a lot of different things in addition to that to really hit ceiling as prospects. There's some similarities there, a lot of differences. Bryce Young's not, the same type of quarterback as Penix necessarily, but the stuff that he's been able to do well so far in his career has been throwing those routes to an Adam Thielen. And I think Xavier Legette is not a real threat to the target share. I think he had a pretty disappointing rookie year, but he's big and he's athletic enough that he's a good guy to have out there running routes with you because he will draw some coverage. I think Jalen Coker's low-key really pretty good. JT Sanders is a potential breakout candidate. I think overall their passing game is going to be good enough that it's not going to be wholly dependent on Tet McMillan to be the only guy getting open. But I think when you look at these profiles, you look at his ability to earn volume per route throughout his college career, I think Tet McMillan's going to step in and earn like 130 plus targets as a rookie. Like immediately, he's just a really, really good fit. The Dave Canales offense, another thing I haven't necessarily mentioned yet, but has been very good for receivers. Even Deontay Johnson, who everyone hates, guy played 7 games in this offense. He had 3 games of 10 plus targets, 75 plus yards, and a TD in 3 of his 7 games. And then they were like, dude, we got to get rid of you. But he actually had some good, the receivers produced. The guys that because that's the guy That's the guy Canales talked about last offseason. They wanted to build the offense around, and they did get games out of him. And then they were like, get out of here. We don't even want you on the team anymore. But when they're building the offense around Adam Thielen, they're able to get the ball to Adam Thielen. When they're building the offense around Jalen Coker a little bit at times, or not necessarily building it around him, but they were able to get the ball to him. It's an offense that gets the ball to the guys they want to get the ball to. They went and drafted McMillan top 10. I think they're going to be able to schematically get the ball. They're going to run a little bit too much. Their pace is not going to be amazing. Some of that stuff's not going to be great. When they do throw, they're going to be able to get the ball to McMillan, whose skills in that intermediate range I think are going to be immediately transferable. And he's going to be a rookie star in redraft, like right away.
I agree 100%. Even when you're mentioning players, how they get involved, like up until his injury last year, like we were starting to see Sanders get involved as well. That's Jatavion Sanders, and you mentioned him there. I think that the Carolina Panthers are probably my favorite kind of cheap stacking option, with McMillan, Young, and Sanders. Coker goes very late as well. You can slot him in. But the other thing you mentioned there, and what's really good is, the way they used him in college and some of the downside of like not giving him some what I would call kind of cheat or free PPR points. And like what we're seeing with, Ja'Marr Chase, Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, Malik Neighbors, Puka Nacua, the guys at the real top end, Amon-Ra St. Brown, they're almost like, spamming, PPR points by getting these short receptions and just kind of giving them that safe floor. But I don't think it's very, like, that's another thing about like when we're projecting for, like, that's quite easy, I think, for the team to work in for him. And he's able to catch a pass if it's thrown 5 yards to him. It's not like you're trying to connect 40 yards downfield. The other thing we talked about on the last show is how to kind of potentially defeat some of these looks where defenses are sitting some of their defensive backs a little bit further back, and maybe like taking advantage of that 10 to 15 yard area is the way to do that as well. So I think there's just a lot of ways that it can play up, and I think people are also discounting him because they're not set on what Young did in the second half of his season last year. So yeah, McMillan is highly exciting and will be on a lot of my rosters this season. We're moving into round 6 through 8. Again, if there's a round you want to skip away. If there's names you want to shout out, shout them out. This is an interesting area of the draft. I am going to pitch up here, and I know you and Sean talked about one of them a couple of weeks ago in round 6, and that was George Pickens. I think that he's very interesting in this range. One of Sean's personal favorites, Jerry Jeudy, Jordan Addison's in there, although there's more talk of the suspension coming up. They would be some of my favorites in this particular area. Who are you shouting out as the best pick of the 6 through 8 range?
I think in each of rounds 6, 7, and 8, the best pick is a wide receiver. I wrote down 5 in this range, and you just named 3 of the 5. So yeah, we're not unsurprisingly, we're not very far off. Another one I would mention is Chris Olave. He has a 2+ yards per out run in all 3 years to begin his career, which is a really impressive number. The routes volume was very low last year because of the concussions. One of the big keys on Olave, as people look at his numbers, that I want to highlight, he only played 8 games. But when you look at his per game stuff, it looks like his yards per game really fell off. It looks like a lot of things really fell off for him. He left 2 of them because of concussions after 2 snaps and 8 snaps. Yeah. And he had a catch in both of those in those 10 snaps. So still like a pretty good rate of, 2 catches on those 10 snaps. But if we pull that stuff out, he basically only played 6 games, but all the per route stats you're going to see on Chris Olave are dividing by 8, right? So you're basically discounting his numbers by like 25%. So for example, he shows us having 5.5 targets per game last year because he has 2 1-target games in that sample. He really had 42 in the other 6 full games, which is 7.0 targets per game. So instead of 5.5, you're all the way up at 7.0. First 2 years, he was at 7.9 and 8.7. He was down a little bit, and this offense was very run-heavy. Part of the reason he was down is they had a couple weird games. Like week 1, they just ran the ball. That's when they had one of their huge games, right? The Saints had the 2 really exciting games in weeks 1 and 2. And I think Olave only had like 3 targets or something in week 1, in part because they only threw like 15 times. I don't have those numbers in front of me, but it was very, very low and bizarre. So you also get that kind of stuff in his sample. But if you go look at his game log, is what I'm saying, basically. Go look at his 6 games that he actually played. The other 5 of them, he's got some games in there where he's got like a 10+ target, multiple games with 10+ targets. He still looks like the same dude. Per route basis, he still looks like the same dude. It is a little bit of a career. It was a career low in targets per route run and a career low in ADOT. So there was a significant decline in his weighted targets per route when you look at the route sample. There are some concerns, but his first 2 years, the volume he was earning made him look like a second round pick, right? Like he was going very, very high, and we're now getting him in what is it, the 8th round, 7th round? I guess he's in the 7th round, middle of the 7th round on FFPC. So the other issue here is, okay, but what about their offense this year? And I do think that's a concern. But you also have Rashid Shaheed coming back from an injury, and that's a knee injury. It was a meniscus, not an ACL. But a lot of times we see guys lose some productivity, and Shaheed relies on the deep efficiency, which to me is the kind of thing where I'm most concerned about. If he loses like 5% of his explosiveness, like that's what makes you so good at scoring long touchdowns, is that extra 5%. Whatever Rashid Shaheed has and has had that has allowed him to consistently score deep touchdowns, even in an NFL that's trying to take those away, you take him back 5 or 10% of his skill level, he's probably not able to do it anymore. It probably just wipes that out entirely, which is like all of his production. It's a massive percentage of his production. They brought Brandon Cooks back, who was terrible 2 years ago and somehow worse last year. His yards per run was like below 1. He's very old and is not productive. The rest of the Taysom Hill, by the way, also coming off a major knee injury, so you don't have that part of the offense to steal volume. Alvin Kamara is 30 and coming off a career high in touches. If he misses time, again, like where's the volume in this? I know it's a very bad offense. I don't think Tyler Shuck's going to be good. Whatever. But Chris Olave is set up to like straightforwardly. He's not the kind of guy that is going to be a first round value necessarily. And usually you want to be drafting dudes with real massive, insane ceilings, but he's going in the 7th round and he's set up to like very straightforwardly have 130 plus targets, and probably be, not amazingly efficient on those and probably not catch a ton of touchdowns, but basically pretty comfortably return like 3rd to 4th round value, I wouldn't be as thrilled about it if you had to take him in the 4th or the 5th round. I still think he would be a value in those ranges based on his profile, based on the rest of this offense, etc. In the 7th round, though, it's like, man, he's going to be, it's not just a small hit. He's going to be a comfortably big hit. He's a little bit extra discounted because of the concussion. My point on Shaheed was a knee injury can sap some of your production. For Olave, I mean, I've talked about this on a couple different podcasts. It's a very specific point. It's whatever, but the concussion stuff is scary. It's also an injury that players fully recover from. It's brain swelling. It's not going to be something that limits his ability to be productive when playing this year. I know what people are going to say. They're going to say, well, what if he gets another concussion? We actually have an example of a guy who had very serious concussion history, get another concussion last year. It was Tua. Tua's very serious concussion history was in 2022. Then in 2023, he played all 17 games. Then in 2024, he did get another concussion. They immediately put him on IR because they wanted to protect him and make sure he missed 4 games. But he was back the minimum after 4 games and played the 5th game after that. And there was never really a doubt. So they put him on IR as kind of a precautionary measure. But again, it's the type of injury, the reality of concussions, the concern is more long-term for the human, and that's scary. But in terms of the way that it actually pans out for time missed, I think people are thinking about it incorrectly for fantasy. The other name is Brandon Cooks, who's now on this team I mentioned. He had some really scary concussion stuff. I didn't draft Brandon Cooks for multiple years because I felt like one more concussion could end his career. He's continued to play long after he got over that period of his career. Again, Tua returned after yet another concussion in 2024. If Olave gets another concussion, I don't think he's a lock to miss the rest of the season. I don't think it's a lock to end his career. And I've heard a bunch of people say that he's one concussion away from the end of his career. Don't think that's true. I think if he gets another concussion early in the year, I don't think he'll miss the rest of the year. I do think you're at risk, like with the Tua example, of maybe missing a few extra games to make sure this guy's healthy. And that's the way they should address it, is if he does get a concussion, have him miss 3 or 4 games. Definitely keep him out. Let's make sure he's healthy. But I do think people are misunderstanding the way that concussions and the accumulation of concussions will affect an in his prime wide receiver as far as playing time goes. And it's kind of a weird, again, an uncomfortable point, but I do think it leads to a multi-round discount in fantasy football for what this player actually is.
Yeah, I was going to say, like I mentioned George Pickens, but Olave is somebody who I've drafted like throughout his career. And as much as I'm kind of like thinking in the past it hasn't always worked out and last year was very tough, I'm like, give me reasons not to draft him at his price. And it's very hard because everything is factored in. Like the concussions is factored in, the QB situation's factored in, the team scenario.
Yeah, what if Shuck is good? If Shuck's good, Olave's the most important player in the 7th round.
And I don't necessarily think he will be good, but I think even if he isn't good, you have a player who you said 130, but I think like a floor of 100 targets. You mentioned like last year, week 1, they beat the Panthers 47-10. They cleaned the floor with them. That was a game where Shaheed did have a 59-yard touchdown right at the beginning of that one. And, you know, it played out in a way where he wasn't involved. But in the games then that he was healthy, like he finishes week 2 with 12.8, but 20.6 points in week 3, 16.7 in week 4. And he did have 18.7 in week 5 when he came back. But you did mention the 2 games where he goes out. So it does look a little bit different. The other thing that, you know, he is going to be turning 25 next week, but like it feels like Chris Olave is like 32 years old at this point, but he's like been in the league for a while, but still at a part of his career where there is room to grow. But when we're looking at multi-round discounts, the player I was looking at is like, I'm looking at a Cortland Sutton or even a DK Metcalf who are going in round 5 at, you know, 12 wide receiver spots ahead of him. And I'm like, if you ask me now, like straight up, who finishes with more PPR points this season, I think Chris Olave beats both of those guys out, and you're getting a 2-round discount. And I'm like, yeah, just give me a reason not to draft him. And it's like
beats them in most scenarios, and beats them when you talk about real ceiling. Like Cortland Sutton's ceiling is not higher than Chris Olave's, even factoring in Chris Olave's, you know, efficiency concerns and the fact that I did their projection the other
everything
day.
Everything is priced in, and it's like I think Jordan Addison too. Like I think with him, the suspension is priced in at his current ADP. Like I think that like we're giving you these guys in round 7 that should be going in round 5, but we've just like dinged them so many different ways that you're getting a discount on them. So Chris Olave, I think I'm all the way back in. Moving through then the next rounds, round 9 through 11. I'm not going to spoil any names here. I'm just going to let you go for it. I'm not just going to spoiler list.
Yeah. Well, one name Sean and I took in an FFPC main event already is a veteran running back, Jordan Mason, who's going 3 rounds behind Aaron Jones on FFPC. I saw a discussion about him on Twitter the other day, and someone was pointing out, he was like, what set are you drafting on? Because they're basically going like, they're going back to back in some rooms on Underdog. It's a lot closer. So this is one that's sort of site specific, where you'll see Mason go ahead of Jones in some cases. There's like a round gap. I'm looking at their Underdog ADP right now. There's like a round gap, but you'll see Mason go ahead of Jones in some rooms over there. When you get him 3 rounds behind Jones, I think that's really enticing. They went and traded for Mason. One of the fascinating things about Mason, they didn't give up a lot of capital to get him, but the Niners, he was going to be a free agent anyway, and they offered a tender on him. They gave them exclusive rights to negotiate with him, which gave them the ability to then trade him, but they weren't going to probably be able to match any contract that was offered. They gave a second-round tender, which meant that if someone else signed him and they weren't able to match, they would get that team's second-round pick. So it basically made it so no one else could do that, because no one's going to probably give up a second-round pick for Jordan Mason. Because they were so aggressive on that, but they also weren't going to be able to match, because financially, San Fran's been in a tough spot. They've let a lot of guys walk this offseason. They weren't going to be able to play Jordan Mason when they've already given a ton of money to Christian McCaffrey. Because of all the little specifics there, they had no leverage. They had to agree to a small amount of trade capital. The Vikings could have just waited, and anyone could have just waited for the second-round tender to expire if he wasn't signed by a certain date, and then they could make him an offer, which is probably what would have happened. The Vikings went out of their way to actually give up some picks to make sure that they're the ones who got him. So it's a small trade package that landed Mason there, but based on all the situational factors and the leverage in the situation, it actually, to me, was a positive development of a team that was going out and proactively saying, we want to make sure we get this guy. I think they really think he's going to be a big part of their offense. Aaron Jones is a year older. They've talked about it explicitly this offseason that Jones probably can't he's not going to be like their workhorse. They didn't treat him as a workhorse last year, but they didn't really have a good second running back. I think Jones is still going to do some stuff in the passing game. He's going to be explosive as sort of a space back, but Siegel is the first one I got to give him credit to kind of make this point to me. He's like, Mason's going to lead this team in carries, and I think he's going to. And you're getting him in the 9th round here as basically the lead rusher. He maybe won't do enough in the passing game to be a massive hit, but I do really like him in the 9th round as a kind of a 0 RB target that's very high floor. And like if Jones gets hurt, it's still got the ceiling. There's still a little bit of handcuff element. It's one of those 9th round running backs we talked about over the years where you get the standalone plus ceiling, but the standalone is actually probably, that's the sort of the case I'm trying to make here. The standalone is probably a lot better than people realize. It's probably real good standalone value. So he's a really fun one. I wrote Josh Downs down, as well as frankly Michael Pittman. I think both the Colts lead receivers are priced as if Anthony Richardson's going to be the full-time starter again, but Daniel Jones, who's not amazing, should at least provide an environment for those guys to do better. Downs had a true breakout year last year. Incredible on a per-out basis. Had some injuries, limit that, but he made some incredible catches down the field, as well as doing a lot of stuff underneath. Really high targets per route. I think it was like 27, 28%. Really kind of took the number 1 role away from Pittman, who himself was still very productive as a number 2 guy playing through a back injury and is probably undervalued as well. That guy had 156 targets 2 years ago when Gardner Minshew was their quarterback in 2023. He's got 156 targets 2 years ago. He's going in the 11th round now this year. I mean, he's going behind some guys that are very clearly, to me, sort of outside the wide receiver window, where I would put both these dudes inside the wide receiver window. They're guys that have meaningful ceiling if this pass game is interesting enough. And then I really like the Jacksonville running backs in this range. And that's both Bhayshul, Tuten, who Sean and I took in both of our main events so far. We took him a little bit higher than where he's going now. He's slid a little bit. But I also think Travis Etienne is really intriguing as well. His price is really affordable. I'm of the mind that Tank Bigsby is just a non-factor. He's going in round 13. I've made the case, and I made the case on the first episode of my that ETR special you mentioned that I've been doing with Mike Leone, that Tank Bigsby's metrics look better for the full season last year than his season actually was. He had one really, really dominant game against a Colts team that was really banged up that week. And then a few weeks later, he had a really good game over across the pond in London over in your neck of the woods, a little bit near your neck of the woods, closer to your neck of the woods than mine.
Yeah.
Against the Patriots. It was the Jags' second consecutive game in London, and so they stayed over there for the week. I think that travel stuff is more important than people realize. The Patriots flew over, I think it was like Friday of that game, and the Jags basically in the second half just ran the ball and just were able to out physical them. And I think a lot of it was just like straight up jet lag. And so anyway, Bigsby got like 29 carries in that game. It's a game Etienne left injured as well. Bigsby, by the way, though, did not have any explosive plays in that game necessarily. And the rest of the season after that week 4 against the Colts didn't have a run over 20 yards. He had a big run in that Colts game that was his highlight of the whole season. He also had a big run the week prior. It was a shotgun draw where he just ran to daylight for like 50 yards. It was any running back in the league could have done it. The case I'm making is basically Bigsby has production that looks better than it was. It was more just like replacement level that a lot of running backs could have done stuff like he did. Other than some of what he did again in that Colts game was pretty impressive. But my point is, like, they were banged up. The defenders he was doing it to were not great. And people have really kind of jumped the shark, I think, a little bit on what Tank Bigsby is and ignoring his rookie season as well, which was very, very bad. He's also a complete zero in the pass game. He did nothing last year. He ran a decent number of routes and had very minimal receiving value at all. Etienne was playing hurt the whole year. They continue to only use Etienne in the pass game. I think if Etienne's the main back, he's going to be very, very good. And then I think if he's not the main back, that it's because Bhayshul Tuten, whose profile is incredibly exciting, and a new regime went out and prioritized on one of the very first picks of day 3. I mean, we think about, day 2, day 3 as a big line of demarcation, but they took him with the 3rd pick of day 3. I think it was the very first picks of round 4. How much different when people think about Bhayshul Tuten if he went 5 picks earlier at the end of round 3? I think people would be like, well, he's a day 2 pick. He's a day 2 running back. I mean, it'd be a meaningful difference. This guy's profile is incredible. Ton of missed tackle force, ton of explosive plays in the college level. Runs like a 4.3 40, just incredibly athletic. So fun to watch the highlights on him. He's fascinating to watch because he would have these breakaway runs and he kind of slow down and let the defender like catch up to him. There's a quote from his running back coach in college where they were trying to tell him to stop doing that, and he was like, "Coach, they're never going to catch me." And he's like, the coach's quote is like, "I didn't realize, like, I don't know what it's like to be as fast as Bhayshul Tuten is, and know that you're never going to be caught. So you can kind of just toy with guys. Like, you're not going to be caught." Anyway, he's a dude that the new regime seems to really like, and he's the one I really like targeting. But I do think there's some potential that he gets brought on a little bit slowly, and that people are underrating the fact that Travis Etienne was banged up last year, that people think Bigsby is like better than Etienne or passed him last year, and it just did not happen. Etienne had back-to-back 1,400-yard seasons in 2022 and 2023. He's a former first-round pick. He has one injury-plagued season, and Bigsby has some inflated numbers that I just talked through why I think they're inflated, and people are thinking Bigsby's better than Etienne. There's no long-term justification for that. His profile coming out of college, nowhere near Etienne's. His production, other than a couple of games last year, nowhere near the stuff that Etienne's been able to do over multiple years. And people have always been down on Etienne, one reason or another, but people are just telling themselves that Travis Etienne's like over the hill. He's not that old. I mean, the gap between Etienne and Bigsby is still very wide, and it's not the direction most people think. And so I think if he can hold off Tuten, can be a very interesting pick as well.
Yeah, I agree on Tuten. And, we're looking back just, 12 months ago to a situation in Tampa Bay. You now have that, offensive coordinator at the time as the head coach, has shown in the past, not afraid to, put a rookie in an expanded role. So you may see Tuten. I think on the Etienne thing, it's more so the fact that he has like spent a large chunk of his career either injured or recovering from injury or not quite 100%. But sure. This is an interesting area off the draft. There's some other names like Jaydon Reed's going in that area. Emeka Egbuka, I think, is potential another interesting name. But this is where you really get into.
Oh, Reed is the other one. I had him as the 6th to 8th round guy. Sorry, but he was the 5th. I mentioned 5 receivers before, and I forgot to mention the 5th name. Jaydon Reed was the 5th name. The list I'm looking at has him at 812. The one you have pulled up here has him at 901. So whether he fits into the last conversation or this one is based on that.
Yeah, so one of the advantages on the RotoViz tool is you can pair it to how many drafts that you or how many days you want to go back. So I've since obviously been a show sheet. We have a day or two maybe of difference, and when I've pulled this up before we started the show, when we look though, it is the real start of the QB window. I think here rounds 9 through 12, kind of. But I do feel like there's a lot of names in here where I'm like, yeah, I could draft him. There's also a lot of names in here where I'm like, absolutely no interest. They may as well just be invisible on my screen at the moment. But there's also a lot of quarterbacks then if you do hit those flat spots where, a Drake May, even a Jared Goff. But you talked about the situation with the Vikings and Jordan Mason, and what if some of these quarterbacks, like you mentioned, what if Shaw is a good quarterback, but what if Bryce Young is good? But what if JJ McCarthy comes in and is good and this offense is explosive? And then that also pairs into the Jordan Mason conversation of an explosive offense getting down inside the 10-yard line, getting those green zone carries. I do think there's a lot of these guys like CJ Stroud, you just talked about on Stealing Bananas last week, Jordan Love. They're all kind of been priced at the worst case scenario already. And it feels like
that's what I was gonna say. Yeah. The McCarthy thing I love, and I would be down to play him. He scrambles a decent amount, but I don't think really enough. Where I mean, I think the situation's really great for McCarthy, and I like to play that passing game through Addison and Jefferson some and Hawkinson, and I just mentioned Mason. And if all those guys hit, McCarthy's going to be good too. But to your point, a lot of these guys are so mispriced. Like Love and Stroud are going in the same round as him.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
I can just take those guys over worrying about whether McCarthy's good, right? Because like I can still play the Vikings passing game through the other pieces. And if McCarthy's really bad and they have to go to whoever their backup is, I honestly don't even know.
You have to know who the Vikings backup quarterback is.
Is it that same dude whose name I can't think of that used to play for the Niners?
It's Sam Howell.
Oh, it's Sam Howell.
It's our boy.
Oh my God, that's right. Who's the backup the last couple years that used to play for the Niners? I can't think of his name.
They've cycled through guys.
Nick Mullins. Nick Mullins they had for a while. That's what I was trying to think.
They had like Josh Dobbs and all. They cycled through a lot of guys.
Yeah. But I mean, if Howell ends up playing for whatever reason, then I still think Addison and those guys can probably get there. Is sort of the point. And anyway,
they'll just have Trevor to do Lawrence on like 2nd and 15, because they'll be taking the sacks.
Yeah, but yeah, you have Drake May in this range. You have Fields. I love your point that this is a good quarterback range. Fields, I think, has a ton of rushing upside. Obviously, I'm not like thrilled about taking him, but I think he could be decent. One of the things I didn't mention about the Etienne point and the Tuten point as well is that Liam Cohen takes over this offense. They generated a ton of high value touches for the backs last year. It was very exciting. I think his scheme is particularly designed to get the ball out quick. Mayfield really executed it well. Who knows if Lawrence can? Lawrence's whole thing has been he pushes the ball downfield to a fault. It's always a good thing, but sometimes throws into coverage too much. Whether Cohen can get Lawrence to actually check the ball down and make the quick passes will be very important because like Godwin was off to an incredible start last year at the lowest ADOT of his career. Mike Evans' ADOT was one of the lower ones of his career, but both of them still had the best yards per out run seasons of their career because they were getting more gimme, again, these matriculate the ball down the field catches. I think that's the point of Cohen's offense is high success rate passing, and that could be really good for Etienne and Tuten. And if that does translate, number one, it'd be really good for Trevor Lawrence, who's never had the elite passing season yet and does run a little bit. But number two, the reason I still kind of like Etienne is even if Tuten hits, you could get the Bucky Irving, Rachaad White thing where they were both productive last year, right? You could get both of these guys producing a little bit at the same time still. Again, if Tank Bigsby is the zero that I'm kind of projecting forward that he might be, that it would be a two-back system, two exciting backs, both producing, a lot of high-value touches. That's pretty fun. It'd be a fun way to play Lawrence as well as a one of the other quarterbacks in this range.
Last kind of range here, we're going to open up the floodgates here to see who Ben wants to shout out, but round basically 12 and beyond, and this is where you get into like, the profiles of players you want to draft. I joked on that last section, there's players that are invisible. There's a lot more that are invisible in this section, but when you work down through it, there's still a lot of interesting names. I feel like once you get to round 15 onwards, there's a lot of late round tight ends from the rookie kind of range, and even a Cole Kmet, who I think is still interesting heading into this year. There's some buzz around Theo Johnson at the minute. You get a lot of the rookie running backs or, second year guys like a Marshawn Lloyd who didn't play last year, but Jarquez Hunter, Brashad Smith, Will Shipley. There's lots of names down here in this back end. But there is a couple of interesting wide receivers then, round 12 has Luther Burden, Jaden Higgins is in there. There's an interesting pathway to really filling out your roster in a nice way. I think Tyjae Spears is a good 0 RB candidate. J.K. Dobbins, we'll see where the ADP actually settles, but he's up to running back 44 in the 12th round at the moment after signing with the Denver Broncos. Is there any players here that, are real priorities for you to get on your rosters?
Yeah, there's a ton. I think if you think about this range as a whole, 12 plus, the biggest thing that you want to do in every single draft this year is make sure you're drafting some of these rookie running backs. This was a dynamic rookie running back class. It's been talked about as generational. Some of these guys are being wildly undervalued because they got quote unquote day 3 capital. I was just talking about it with Tuten.
We always knew that we were going to have like day 3 capital on a lot of these guys, and it's like been double price now because it's we talk about like in these drafts where like we have a tier, and I joked about it in I think it was the 3rd round, and I kind of want to get the last player of that wide receiver group, but it was going to be the same in the NFL draft this year where teams were like, from the running back 7 through the running back like 20 is all the same to us. We just want to get one of those guys on our roster, and that's what happened. And then we're like, well, they went on, as you say, on day 3.
Well, and it's an opportunity cost thing. Even if they had their preferences, if you think the class is deep at running back and it's already a position that's been devalued around the league, and you know that the running back position, there's not going to be 10 running backs that go by the end of day 2. You don't feel any pressure. Then you're like, okay, when I'm building out my draft plan, I'm going to make a point to circle day 3 as when I'm going to be addressing running back, because I think there'll be something there for us. But I only have so many picks. The opportunity cost, I want to address the other positions in the higher leverage rounds. And I think that's what you're obviously seeing and saw. You obviously are seeing from the league over multiple years where teams understand now that the other teams are not going to overly prioritize running back, so they don't necessarily have to do it outside of a few select situations. But when you get in a situation like 2025, where this running back class was so deep and there was a lot of running backs that were like ranked 10th, that everyone was saying this would be a top 5 running back in most classes, but he's ranked 10th in this class. And so was the 9th, and so was the 8th, and so was the 7th. They would all be top 5 backs in other classes. And you get that dynamic, you're not going to get prices that reflect that dynamic. You just can't. You can't get all 10 of those guys going by the end of day 2 unless you get an entire league acting irrationally and chasing up prices on something that, again, the opportunity cost would be too high to do when you can think that you can get value later. And especially because it wasn't just 10. It was even like people thought that 15 running backs deep. Like you said, you went RB7 to RB20 or whatever. Like there's a lot of good, intriguing backs in this class. So if you're thinking about it from any type of
like, I know from my dynasty drafts, you have your like pre-draft rankings, and then like I've like loaded up for like when the waiver wire opens, I'm like, there's 6 guys that went undrafted that I want to, it's that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, you want to be targeting this group. And so I'll start a late 11th round ADP, Jaydon Blue, I really, really like in Dallas. Dylan Sampson, Sean has gotten me completely in on, which is the case that I was discounting that he's, he's the second back drafted in his own backfield for the Browns. They did take Quinshon Judkins. The way he looked at it was like, well, compare him to like Tyler Algier or these other guys, DJ Giddens or Will Shipley. These other 3 names I just mentioned, they're behind workhorses. They're behind Bijan Robinson, Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley. They're not going to get a piece of the pie unless of an injury. They're pure handcuffs. Sampson, are they really going to give Quinshon Judkins that treatment in year 1? What if Sampson's just better than Judkins? Some people had him ranked higher. He was like, for a lot of people, the RB6 or RB7 in this class. Judkins was like the RB4. They did. Clearly, the Browns internally prioritized Judkins. They still took Sampson around 4. It wasn't like Sampson fell to around 6. I think he's going to play alongside Judkins a lot. People are talking a lot about Jerome Ford. I don't think Jerome Ford really plays much. I think they use these 2 running backs a lot. Ford will early in the year, the first month or so. But as you get going throughout the season, you're going to see, I think, Judkins and Sampson as a 2-headed backfield to a certain degree. You're getting a lot more floor plus ceiling out of Sampson like the Jordan Mason case I was making, but a lot more than you realize for the price. It's fantastic in round 15. Jarquez Hunter is a really exciting profile, maybe a little bit more handcuffy there. Brashard Smith, we know Siegel loves him. You don't think so? I mean, they love him. Tahj Brooks with the Bengals, I think he's going to be have a real clear role. I think Zach Moss is going to get cut. I don't think Samaje Perine was bad 2 years ago for the Broncos, got cut, had a ton of opportunity ahead of him with the Chiefs last year and didn't play much at all. I do think he's going to play a little bit to start the year, but I think Tahj Brooks is really quickly going to move into the Perine role alongside Chase Brown, kind of working off of Chase Brown. And so, look, this guy's going in the 18th round, and I think he's going to have a real role. He's going to get touches. Trevor Etienne, I don't even think is on this list unless I'm missing his name.
It's wild.
I don't think people realize this. He was the very next back taken in round 4 after. So I think a lot of people do realize that. Well, first of all, there were 6 backs taken by the end of round 2. So I was saying that 10 couldn't go, but 6 did go. You had the 2 in the first round, Ginty and Hampton. You had the 2 at the very top of the second round, which was the 2 Ohio State guys. Judkins went first, then Travion Henderson. And then you had RJ Harvey later in round 2, and you had Caleb Johnson in round 3. That was the 6 guys. Then right when day 3 started, Bhayshul Tuten was the second pick of round 4. Cam Skattebo was the third pick. Trevor Etienne was the 12th pick of round 4. He was then the next running back to go. I think a lot of people think about all the rest of the backs as if they were. I think people are pulling Tuten and Skattebo up a little bit because they were so close to day 2, at least a little bit. I mentioned that I think if they went in day 2, they'd be even higher. But Etienne was like basically every other back, I think in most people's mind is just a day 3 back. But Etienne went very high in round 4, and the Panthers took him over a lot of other really good backs. To me, he's the back in this class that has that little thing that's similar to what Bucky Irving was last year, where we talked about this on Stealing Bananas a lot, but Bucky Irving was ranked like 10th in everybody's lists of the running back class, and he went like RB7. And just the fact that the Bucs took him ahead of multiple guys that a lot of the consensus boards had ranked ahead of him was an indication that they liked him and that they saw the positives in his profile, which he was really dynamic from a production standpoint and peripheral standpoint and all the on-field stuff in college. But the one knock on Irving was that his combine wasn't great. His top speed wasn't great, etc. We did see a little bit of that last season. He broke a ton of tackles, didn't necessarily house his long runs. He had a lot of long runs that didn't finish in touchdowns for one reason or another. But anyway, that was the thing that was being used to hold Irving down. This note that he went higher in the running back class than he was expected to go was something we talked a lot about on Bananas as a very positive, that the team bought into him. That's what draft capital typically tells you. Trevor Etienne is that guy this year, where, Bhayshul Tuten and Cam Skattebo were ranked very highly, and they go really quickly on day 3. But then with everyone else still on the board, Jarquez, Hunter, Dylan Sampson, everyone else I just mentioned, and those guys went in round 4 not long after Etienne. But the Panthers chose Etienne over all of those guys. And that was a little bit of a surprise at the time. It's actually pretty darn interesting. He had pretty good missed tackle force stuff. He was pretty solid in yards after contact. He was okay in yards per out run. He had 32 catches last year, 21 the year before in 2 different offenses. He was with Georgia last year and Florida the year before. He's probably a pretty capable receiving back. What's interesting about that is Chuba Hubbard is not. Chuba Hubbard's a very fascinating player. He's really good, but he's fairly straightforwardly a very good rusher and a bad receiving back. His work hasn't necessarily aligned that way, but that's what he is. He's really good at like yards after contact. He's not great at evading tackles or missed tackle force stuff, which goes back to this thing of like, he's good at reading out runs. He's good at running downhill and breaking tackles, and his rushing efficiency is always good as a result. That's the yards after contact stuff. When you get him in space, he does not really actually evade a lot of tackles, and his yards per target stuff has been very, very low. And he's not a very good receiver. Etienne's probably going to start behind Rico Dowdle, but I think pretty quickly, when you're talking about him being the 9th running back overall taken in this class, in a good class where he was ranked in the teens probably, and for a lot of people, he's the receiving back this year down like the rest of the way after the first few weeks after he beats out Dowdle. So the fact that he's not even being drafted, he's not even on this visual that you have pulled up, is wild to me. Again, 9th back. There's a ton of backs that went after him that are being drafted from this rookie class. For whatever reason, the draft capital has not been enough for people to get on Trevor Etienne, and he just doesn't even get drafted. You mentioned a few other names I'm just going to rapid fire throughout. You mentioned the late round tight ends, JT Sanders, the young ones, JT Sanders, Terrence Ferguson, and Harold Fannin. The rookies, I think, are all very interesting. Daniel Jones is, I think, the cheap way to play quarterback if you get really deep in round 16. Wan'Dale Robinson in round 15 is a guy who can really earn volume. People don't want to take him because his yards per reception were so low last year. That could have been quarterback related a little bit, kind of a knock on Daniel Jones maybe. If their quarterback plays better, if Jackson Dart's good, for example, if he just wins the job outright, Wan'Dale Robinson's probably the second best receiver in this offense. He still earns a ton of volume. His targets per out was still good. It was good as a prospect. It's been good throughout his pro career. The efficiency hasn't been good, and people are using that as a reason he can never have ceiling. But what if it's not? What if he's able to? I mean, I think you can flip that and say he earns volume and has that skill and could be efficient eventually. So he's intriguing to me in round 15. I mentioned Deontay Johnson earlier. He's going completely undrafted. That guy still earned, or he's actually there on your visual in round 20. But that guy actually earned
87.
He earned targets on 27% of his routes last year. His efficiency was horrible. He got kicked off like 4 teams because nobody liked him. It's not good. But the fact that this player can get open as much as he can and has such a long history dating to college of being so good at earning volume per route in a ton of different offenses. And I mean, I think I wouldn't take him in best ball, where it's a high likelihood of being a 0, but in managed, somebody who could actually have some real value this year that's going completely undrafted. I mean, I think he's worth a flyer this early in the offseason. The young receivers late that I like are Jalen Coker. Talked about that pass game a little bit, that Panthers pass game. And then Alec Ayomanor, which I wasn't really into him from the prospect profile perspective. Did the Titans projection. I think Cam Ward could be a real upgrade for what Brian Callahan wants to do. I don't think the Titans are going to be good or anything, but he has like no competition in front of him. The number 2 is Tyler Lockett, who looks like he's completely done. Calvin Ridley's okay. Chika Okonkwo is like another way to maybe think about playing into that, but with Gunnar Helm there, like I don't think the tight ends are really going to be the answer.
They got a couple getting a 5-round discount on Okonkwo as well. You know, yeah. If you're thinking of playing into it, like go for the guy that's 5 rounds.
Who's the potential breakout number 2 target earner in this offense? I think it's got to be Ayomanor over Chimere Dike or what do they have? Xavier Restrepo as a UDFA. Those guys don't really have strong profiles either. They brought in 3 rookie receivers, but he seems like the one that makes sense to be trying to play into. Again, at a 19th round price tag. I wouldn't be super into him at like a 13th round price tag. I wouldn't be into him in the 15th round probably, where you can get Wan'Dale. But if you need a receiver and you're trying to find some upside late, I think he's interesting in the 19th round. So, but yeah, the big thing is those rookie backs that we were talking about.
Yeah, exactly. I think you want to have your receivers really, sorted and ready before, you get out of round 12. But there is a couple of names, if you do need them. You mentioned most of them there, but a kind of narrow path to adding some late on. Pat Bryant, I would probably toss into that. The other one that's going in this range that's kind of interesting that had a really strong finish last year, but obviously that was down as well to injuries to his teammates, and that's Jalen McMillan. He's going as the wide receiver 68. He had a pretty nice run, but obviously they drafted Buka, and both wide receivers should be healthy. I do want to highlight that I did say when you mentioned Jarquez Hunter, I wanted to highlight that I mentioned I don't think he's the backup for the reason that I think he will make his way to be the starter rather than I just don't like him. I think him and Kittle are the 2 guys I find it very hard and over at the FFPC not to prioritize to get on the roster. I just think that there's, if we look back to what happened last year with Kyron Williams, there's a huge amount of his numbers that are tied into obviously the volume and getting in the end zone. And if that touchdown efficiency goes away, I think there's a big difference in the picture between those 2. But the thing with the running backs, you mentioned Tahj Brooks, kind of talked there as well, obviously about Etienne. And if you're looking here with Hunter, you're looking at those running backs with big gaps in ADP from where their starter is going and what the picture is for them to close that gap, or how picture changes if one of those guys misses some time. So I think Hunter fits into that. I think Marshawn Lloyd fits into that as well. But there's a lot of, this is like when we're talking about, on the previous show about a 0 RB season, you're set up here with a running back class that gives you a lot of the pieces at the back of the board. You will need to front load it in some situations, but it is well set up. We are going to close it out there for this edition. We went a little bit longer than we had anticipated, but we dived into a lot of player names, and hopefully people will find that useful when they are trying to figure out who to prioritize or put on their draft charts for 2025. We also talked on the show, I teased this at the start, but we talked a little bit through kind of philosophies and what you maybe want to take into your draft plan and think through some ways for this season on the opening show. Did tell you a little bit at the start about Stadium Signals, would highly recommend checking that out. Follow Ben on social media at Yards for Gretch. Check out Stadium Bananas, which we've referenced multiple times with Sean Siegel. And of course, your piece, your series that I mentioned with Mike Leone that is coming out over the coming weeks with Ben. Anything as we get ready to close up here that you want to give a pitch to the listeners for?
Yeah, the newsletter, again, bengretch.substack.com. You mentioned we went a little long. If anyone listening here isn't listening to Stealing Bananas, then you should check us out. Especially if you're still
I
listening.
usually say over 30 minutes is long for me, very short for Ben.
It's very short for me. If you're still listening at this point in the pod, I assume that you are aware of Stealing Bananas and are aware of why it went long today.
They have to be one of the Banana Boys, Ben, if they're still listening.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, no, awesome to link up with Ben, talk through some of these things. I appreciate everyone listening in. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast feed to get those once they are available. My name is Colm Kelly. Follow me on socials at Overtime Ireland. Check out Ben at Yards for Gretch. And until we are back, have a good one.